What makes a game not just popular, but a viral sensation? Gaming has been around for longer than most of us at this point, and since the advent of the internet, games come and go rather rapidly. Sometimes they hit hard. I'm not talking about the latest AAA titles or the Kickstarter game with 400,000 backers, those do certainly happen, but I'm talking about games that people talk about for months, maybe years. Games that define not just someone's childhood or adulthood, but games that define generations of gamers. These are viral games. They hit hard and fast. Some linger then fade into oblivion, and some persist for years and years, getting milked for all they're worth. In this series, I plan to cover some of history's most viral games, discussing why they were so popular and what about them made them click with their audience, and how they are doing today. Welcome to Viral Retrospective. Before we get started, please consider a like, comment, and subscription at some point during this video. It would mean a lot, and it'll let YouTube know that I deserve a place in the algorithm. But only do it if you feel like I've earned it by the end of the video. For my first episode, I'm going to dig into an untapped well. Something no YouTuber has ever talked about before, a viral game that you may have never heard of. This little game is called Five Nights at Freddy's. Keep in mind, this is not a lore video. FNAF has been done to death, and I'm not the kind of gamer who sees 4 numbers on a chalkboard in a random out-of-bounds area that you have to glitch to and tries to decipher them. Jokes aside, most of you know the history of the franchise. It's actually somewhat similar to the story of Final Fantasy. Cawthon had been making games for a while, mostly religious games, and they were flopping pretty bad. One universal feedback he got, however, was that his animation style was creepy and kinda looked like animatronics, as you would find somewhere like Chuck E. Cheese. The biggest one that is called out is Chipper & Sons, and if you look back and look at that game now, it does straight up look like if you play it long enough, it'll just turn into a FNAF game. This game that was released in 2013, however, was the origin story of Five Nights at Freddy's, a little free-to-play construction management game that just didn't get the desired reception. Thanks to the success of Five Nights at Freddy's, however, the game has gotten a proper amount of attention. Scott was ready to hang up his coding keyboard, but had one more in him. And with the feedback he got of the animals and Chipper constantly being called scary and creepy, he decided to use that style to make a horror game. To be clear, Scott had no idea FNAF was going to be what it is. He didn't plan out a long, drawn-out, convoluted story. Ever since that first game, Scott has been learning his storytelling style, which has evolved from an almost inability to tell a coherent story to him and others involved in the franchise desperately trying to continue said story with little regard for canon. Regardless, Five Nights at Freddy's released on August 18th, 2014. Five Nights at Freddy's itself is a pretty simple and easy to understand game. You can't move, you cannot defend yourself beyond shutting doors to prevent enemies from gaining entry, and the player agency is simply survival until the timer runs out. While you wait, you check the various security cameras around the pizzeria and try to time it so that you close the doors at the last possible instant so as to not waste battery power and letting you continue to close doors later. This is the game where the core cast of Foxy, Bonnie, Chica, and Freddy, as well as the infamous Golden Freddy, were introduced. We had no real explanation for anything back then. Who did we play as? What was going on with the pizzeria? Why were the robots attacking us? Why were we even there? Why did we stay? These questions would not actually be addressed until much later in the series, and still to this day we have no solid definitives, just guesses upon guesses to compensate for retcon after retcon. But that in and of itself is the strength of the franchise, and one of the many reasons it thrives to this day. You see, people love mysteries, and horror has the strongest ones. When's the last time you saw a detective story that you could play along with and figure out before the protagonist? It's probably been a while. Best I can think of was Sherlock back in 2010. The reason for this is mysteries are hard to do. Too many clues and the viewer can know exactly what's going on halfway through, and too few and they may feel cheated or frustrated. It's a fine line. FNAF has accidentally towed this line perfectly. The game ended with just enough information to absolutely enthrall the masses. We knew that children were haunting the bots, and we knew someone had to put them in there, but otherwise everything was in shadow. And that was the hook that kept people coming back, trying to solve the core mystery. As we approach the 10-year anniversary of the franchise, we still basically don't know anything. In fact, canonically, we don't even know if Five Nights at Freddy's 1 through 4 are even real. But again, we're getting too deep into lore. Let's get back on track. Now, there are 2 major factors for the game's success. The first is timing.
You see, back in 2014, horror games certainly existed, but the genre was slow. Indie games were still not quite at the point where people were giving them a consistent try, but just before FNAF came out, there were a few viral horror games that, while they lacked the sustained impact of FNAF in the long term, helped it become what it is. Some examples are Slender Man, Among the Sleep, and a few others that were helping the genre pick up, but nothing really made it take off in such a permanent fashion. One could honestly replace FNAF in a lot of these accolades that I'll be giving in the video with Slender Man, but you can clearly see at this point that while impactful, Slendy lacked the staying power of Freddy. In 2014, gaming YouTubers like Jacksepticeye, PewDiePie, and Markiplier were starting to really hit their stride and grow, and watch them get super spooked became an addiction for many viewers, myself included, and we were all chomping at the bit for more. In fact, Markiplier's FNAF playthrough started on the same day as PT was released. As a quick aside, I've mentioned several times that Five Nights at Freddy's was released on August 14th. That is partially true, that's when it was released on Steam, but the reason Mark was able to play it on August 8th is because it was first released on a Steam-like platform that I honestly don't even remember, called Desura. So that's why I keep saying August 14th instead of August 8th. Moving on. Every YouTuber on the planet at this time was looking for the next big horror game to make them scream in front of the camera and give them those sweet thumbnail reactions and clicks. And then, they found it. Hot on the success of Among the Sleep and hungry for more growth, Markiplier became one of the first big innovators to pick up FNAF.
Now, if you want to know more about early innovators and early adapters, I'd highly recommend Game Theory's episode on it called Game Theory, Flappy Bird, PewDiePie, and Pasta Sauce. But the short version is that for things to go viral, they have to have innovators pick that thing up and show it to people. From there, early adapters grab it and give it a chance and show it to more people, which slides into the early majority, late majority, and finally, the bell curve ends at laggards. This is the general life cycle of a viral game. Markiplier, as well as many other innovators and early adapters,
Putting eyeballs on this brand new franchise,
generated an absolute maelstrom of content and showed a desire for horror games which allowed FNAF to break through indie obscurity and enter mainstream mayhem. With the success of FNAF, Scott got to initiate the realization of his dream and began turning this viral hit into a full-on cornerstone franchise, and in less than 3 months he managed to release Five Nights at Freddy's 2, which basically sealed the deal on the franchise's success and Scott's wealth. This was absolutely huge. Before people could even start to comprehend their feelings on FNAF, and long before we could forget about it, they now had a second game. Influencers swarmed it, and the fans of said influencers absolutely devoured the content. We were introduced to more robots, more history, more mechanics, and more lore! Virtually no questions were answered, and even more questions were presented. It was just enough to launch FNAF into the gaming zeitgeist stratosphere, where it would stay. At this point, MatPat had begun to make FNAF theories, which continue to this day, even after his retirement on the Game Theory channel. Speaking of which, another great Game Theory video, if you want to see the ripple effects of Five Nights at Freddy's on individuals, I would highly recommend MatPat's final FNAF theory, Game Theory, FNAF Thanks for the Memories. As far as YouTube careers go, FNAF bolstered many tubers, and those careers have caused ripple effects. As an example, we can easily talk about MatPat himself. I'm sure with his talent and abilities he would have hit it eventually, but if FNAF let him hit his stride far earlier than might otherwise have been possible, and now he's gone from a guy in his closet trying to jack up his resume to having just retired and passed his legacy of multiple YouTube channels off on new talented creators. Markiplier, who was a small channel back in 2014 by today's standards, has done multiple large projects including Unus Annus, In Space with Markiplier, and now has a feature film in production based on the game Iron Lung. FNAF's impact within and outside of the gaming world is nearly immeasurable. Not just YouTubers, but game developers have found success thanks to FNAF that may otherwise not have been found. Steel Wool, which now makes the FNAF games, was largely unheard of. There are endless FNAF clones on itch.io, Steam, and various other mediums. There are FNAF books and movies, analog horror such as the Walton Files and the Backrooms, while having their own fan base at this point, very much owe their success at least in part to FNAF's indirect storytelling. That's not to say any of these people do not deserve their success. We are talking about incredibly talented and creative filmmakers and game developers, but FNAF was absolutely a steroid shot for all those instances. Hot off the heels of FNAF 2, FNAF 3 launched in March of 2015, and FNAF 4 came out a mere 4 months after that. That is 4 absolute smashes back to back to back. Keep in mind, this was 2014-2015. For perspective on how insane it is to put out 4 consecutive smash hits, that was the same year that Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced, and that wasn't released until 5 years later. While other companies were spending half a decade and millions of dollars working on AAA titles, Scott was dropping banger after banger within 3 to 4 months of each other on a shoestring budget. Now granted, in modern day, the core mechanics of FNAF aren't terribly interesting because we have done it a dozen times over, so if you go back and play the original game, you not only might not have a ton of fun with it, but you also will discover it isn't super scary anymore. This is precisely why the franchise had to start evolving more than just its storytelling. FNAF 4 was supposed to be the last game in the franchise, but whether or not that was ever true will likely never be known. Did Scott intend to retire, or was he making us let our guard down? Given how quickly the next couple of games came out, I would bank on the latter. After FNAF 4, the franchise got quiet for longer than it had been up to that point, and then FNAF World was released. A giant departure from previous games, this was a sort of active time turn-based RPG with character collector mechanics. Scott hated it. Not only was the game weird and convoluted, but most of the subsets, such as the hints for sister location, were hidden behind glitches that would be accidental in most games. This title honestly could have its own video on how it was released, received, and then pulled and released again later, but since it's non-canon, it's best just to mention it and move on. At any rate, in October 2016 we get FNAF 5, or Sister Location. Incidentally, Sister Location was my own first venture into the franchise's gameplay. Up until then, I was a spectator, a viewer, but my playthrough of Sister Location survives on this very channel to this day. And this was actually an awesome starting point as a player, because this is when FNAF evolved from staring at cameras to its minigame format. Sister Location introduced a slew of new bots and a new antagonist named Ennard, which is kind of like a spaghetti robot that can enter hollow bots as well as humans. For the longest time, Sister Location, while pretty fun, drove lore hunters insane because it just did not fit in any sort of theory or timeline, and those questions wouldn't even be close to resolved until a 2024 release. The release of Sister Location is also when Scott got cheeky with the lore and hints, and started implementing ARG elements on websites and other forms of media. He would hide hints and even full-on character dialogue in the code of the game's webpage, and would maintain this form of storytelling at least up to the point of this video's creation. 14 months later, a free FNAF game would come out called Pizza Simulator. At first, it seemed like another throwaway FNAF World-style game, but after a few minutes of playing, we were introduced to the fact that we were in fact playing FNAF 6. Just like that, the internet exploded again. All the usual suspects jumped on the game in terms of content creation, and a slew of new animatronics were introduced, including the fan favorite and lore dump extraordinaire, Candy Cadet, as well as the off-brand animatronics like the mediocre Melodies. Also, keep in mind that through all of this, there are books being released pretty regularly that, while not actually canon to the games, help elaborate and explain concepts that Scott hadn't thought of, had not actually had the chance to elaborate on in games such as Remnant. Again though, this is not a lore video and I am not qualified to dive into Remnant and all those intricacies of the story. Overall, that's the history of FNAF and how it solidified itself in the gaming zeitgeist. It is one of the most important franchises in gaming history, as it's basically launched horror games back into the forefront of video gaming. I fully believe that FNAF is the reason why Alan Wake 2, all of the new Resident Evil remakes and sequels were made, and even Konami bringing the Silent Hill franchise out of dormancy. The amount of FNAF-style games such as Five Nights at Lumpty's, the creators and indie developers that got their start by making FNAF clones, Bendy and the Ink Machine, Poppy's Playtime. All these things owe their success in part to FNAF paving the way for narratively driven horror games, which is hilarious because the original barely had a narrative.
FNAF, in turn, owes its success to games like Amnesia and Among the Sleep, as well as Slender Man.
And while I could trace horror gaming all the way back to Sweet Home for the Famicom, of which I also have a playthrough on the channel, I'll save that for another series I have in mind. The conclusion is that Five Nights at Freddy's effectively invented the mascot horror genre. With the release of the FNAF movie in 2023, another in production, books still being written and games still being made, I don't think FNAF will follow the trend of other viral games anytime soon. It has this magical, irrational staying power that many have tried to replicate and none have succeeded. We've had many years of FNAF, the latest being 2024, which is fitting given the 10-year anniversary approaching, and I have a feeling that we'll have many, many more as time marches onward. We'll have to wait and see, but the true year of FNAF was August 19th, 2014 to July 24th, 2015. That was the year the entire gaming industry and a huge portion of the internet at large, as well as many, many people's lives, were changed forever. FNAF continues to this day, with the most recent release being FNAF Help Wanted 2. In my humble opinion, though I didn't get to play it due to a lack of a VR headset, it's very clearly the best game in the franchise to date. Go check it out if you haven't. I'm sure there are many more games to come in the future, as this franchise has no signs of slowing down or stopping outside of longer development cycles because the games have to evolve for a modern audience who is immune to simple JPEG jump scares. There's only one known upcoming official FNAF game called Five Nights at Freddy's Into the Pit, which will be another departure for the series as it looks to be a pixel side-scroller that will relate more to the books than the game or the movies. In the books, there's a ball pit that lets you time travel. FNAF gets real weird. Hey, thank you so much for watching! This is certainly different from my normal content, but viral games fascinate me. I was 29 when FNAF was released, and as a man who's about to turn 40 a mere 11 days after writing the draft for this script, it really hit me that the series is turning 10 years old. That is a quarter of my life. I want to cover more viral games in the future, such as Undertale and Doki Doki Literature Club. If you have any others you want to see, let me know in the comments below. I would love to know your history and thoughts on the franchise. I know that FNAF can be very volatile. As many people love it as hate it, I'm sure. As always, likes, comments, subscriptions, and all that good stuff let YouTube know that you think I deserve to be seen, and I will see you in the next one. Deuces, dummies.